Colleagues, greetings from Songdo, greetings from the Independent Evaluation Unit. Welcome to this side event ahead of the 30th meeting of the Board of the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. My name is Archie Rastogi. I'll be a moderator for today. And today we have the distinct pleasure of being joined by two esteemed panel members. Our first panel member will be Mr. Andres Struyman, Head ad interim of the IEU. Andres, how are you?
Good evening to all.
Great. And our second panel member will be Mr. Henry Gonzalez, who's very new to the GCF and has taken over as the director of the private sector facility. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you so much. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all of us who are here in this important conversation.
Thank you so much, both of you, to make the time and to speak with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Andres will introduce to us the key findings and conclusions and recommendations of this evaluation, and we'll have the opportunity to hear from Henry the key aspects of the management response of the Secretariat to this evaluation. But just before we turn to that, a few housekeeping things. We'll use, please feel free to raise questions and comments and address your concerns to the panel members or raise discussions. For that, we'll use a Padlet for this session, for this next hour. The link to the Padlet is in your chat boxes coming up in a second, and please feel free to make use of that link and type your questions and comments, make introductions as well, and have a discussion on that platform. On this, but you please also feel free to raise your hand, use the raise your hand feature in the Zoom, and we'll come back to you after the presentations of the panelists. I should say that the meeting is being recorded and the IU may use it for dissemination in the future. And before we turn to the panelists, let me make a very quick introduction to this evaluation and to this report. The next slide, please. The report is before you, the report of the independent evaluation to the evaluation of the Green Climate Fund's approach to the private sector. The link is now in your chat boxes or coming to your chat boxes very shortly as well, and is now available, is online, and is shared with the board. The evaluation was a challenging one, but was also undertaken by a formidable and a very pleasant team of colleagues, professionals. You can see them in the picture that's coming on your screen now. They were ever smiling, ever pleasant, and supported by a team of dogs as well. But let me make a very quick introduction to the team, and some of them are online, and you might see some of them waving as we go. So from the Independent Evaluation Unit, the team included Asha Varsame, Andres Struyman, from whom we'll hear in a moment, Ilan Toko Makano, Halina Uvarova, Helena Suna, Mark Hopkins, and Peter Mondry. And I had the opportunity to join that team as the task lead as well. And as well, we were supported by a team of external experts who included Daniela Ray Christen, Leila Swan, Maria Espinoza, and Ryan Hogarth. And today, representing this team, Mr. Andres Struyman, the head ad interim of the IU, will introduce to us the findings and recommendations of this evaluation. Over to you, Andres, without further ado.
Thanks, Archie. And as Archie said, I'm very pleased, and we are all very pleased here at the IU to submit this report to the board of the GCF. Also in order to help the fund to revisit some of its processes, policies, and features, and ultimately improve its support and activities in the fight against climate change. So from an institutional perspective, we know that GCF will promote a paradigm shift towards low emission and climate resilient development pathways, and taking into account the needs of those developing countries, particularly vulnerable to adverse effects of climate change. To achieve this objective, the GCF has a clear mandate to catalyze climate finance, both public and private. Throughout this evaluation, the IU identified 5 core provisions that are discernible in the GCF mandate on the private sector. And they are as follows: to channel private sector finance, including catalyzing finance, to pursue a country-driven approach, to ensure geographic and thematic balance between adaptation and mitigation, to ensure efficiency and effectiveness in promoting participation of private sector actors, and to promote enabling environments necessary to enable the private sector actors and involvement in small island development states, as well as the LDCs, the least developed countries. So given those 5 core provisions, I would now like you to have a look at the 5 key conclusions, and I will introduce them in the following slides, as well as our recommendations very briefly. So first, drawing from the governing instrument of the fund will play a key role in channeling new, additional, adequate, and predictable financial resources to developing countries, and will catalyze climate finance. So the GCF has successfully channeled new financial resources to the developing countries. It has also leveraged large-scale co-funding from public and private sources. However, it has not leveraged an equal large scale of private funding at national level, partly because the access and the process of securing funding is slow and highly unpredictable, which presents a barrier to most private sector actors. A distinction is needed, and it's needed to be made between catalyzing finance and leveraging co-funding. The USP, however, uses both of these words interchangeably and overemphasizes most often leverage ratios as the measure of impact of private sector activities. The PSF to date has focused on maximizing leverage in individual projects rather than catalyzing private finance for adaptation and mitigation activities more broadly. So the second point here on your slide relates to the question of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement states that the GCF would ensure efficient access to climate finance in the context of national climate strategies and plans. And also the governing instrument describes the pursuit of a country-driven approach and promoting and strengthening the engagement at country level. Despite these mandates, the private sector facility has a limited engagement with national governments to align spending on private sector projects with national climate strategies and plans. In fact, under the private sector facility, project origination is driven primarily by the international accredited entities, with most often multi-country projects, which translate into a limited country ownership. The third point relates again to the governing instrument, to the fact that it states that the fund will have a private sector facility that enables it to directly and indirectly finance private sector mitigation and adaptation activities at national, regional, and international levels. In fact, the private sector projects, or the private sector facility projects, pardon me, have primarily been implemented by international accredited entities, as I said before, and have been heavily weighted towards energy sectors and other mitigation result areas. As other evaluations have pointed out, the private sector facility has provided, unfortunately, very little finance for adaptation activities. It has also invested very little to supporting the upstream enabling environment that could indirectly result in private financing flows to adaptation and mitigation activities. So the GCF support for policy and regulatory reforms, as well as technical capacity building and readiness, is delivered primarily with a limited targeting and limited consultation with the private sector. Next slide, please. The fourth key conclusion that we draw from the evidence of this evaluation report is linked to, again, to the governing instruments, which says that the facility, and here the private sector facility, will promote the participation of private sector actors in developing countries, in particular local actors, including small and medium-sized enterprises and local financial intermediaries. MSMEs are central to the implementation of mitigation and adaptation action that are commonly included in the SIDS and the LDC's national climate plans. So those could be sustainable fishing practices, climate smart agriculture, energy efficiency in buildings, or small scale manufacturing, to only name a few. The deployment of these actions tend to require numerous small transactions in local currencies, which will likely be more efficiently deployed through local financial intermediaries. In turn, are likely to be direct access entities. While we have several private sector direct access entities accredited here at the fund, almost no funding flows through them. And as a result, the private sector facility has not delivered on its mandate to fully promote the participation of local private sector actors and financial intermediaries in the financing of climate action in the countries. Lastly, again, the governing instrument stipulates that the fund will strive to maximize impact of its funding for adaptation and mitigation and seeking a balance between the two. In addition to it, the private sector facility will also support activities that enable the private sector involvement in the SIDS and LDCs. Despite this mandate to balance adaptation and mitigation efforts, the private sector facility portfolio has provided very little funding for adaptation projects overall. The private sector facility support for private sector projects in the SIDS and LDCs have focused mainly on mitigation projects, despite the fact that it is those countries that are recognized under the UNFCCC as highly vulnerable to climate change. So stakeholders have recognized that the key challenge to finance adaptation projects is to show how can they be profitable and how they can generate revenue streams. So overall, we found that the GCF has shown limited results with regards to investment in an enabling environment for private sector adaptation, channeling sufficient finance by direct access entities, exhibiting sufficient risk appetite in achieving its mandate to enable those private sector involvements in the LDCs and the SIDS. Next slide, please. So I will now just briefly go through the high-level recommendations, again following the same structure as for the 5 key conclusions, using the five provisions. So next slide, please. So first, on the channeling of financial resources and the question of catalyzing opportunities. Here, the IEU recommends the board and the secretariat to clarify that the GCF is, in fact, a high-risk fund that aims to catalyze investments in transformative adaptation and mitigation projects, rather than only a high leverage fund that aims to maximize the quantity of co-investments. Secondly, the IEU recommends the Secretariat to enhance the speed and transparency of GCF operations to align with the private sector needs for efficiency, but most importantly, predictability. The second area it relates to the pursuit of country ownership, and it is here described in the third recommendation. So the IEU recommends that the Secretariat should take measures to ensure that private sector projects are country owned. The access to GCF should be informed by a country-driven approach, directed and prioritized by the NDC gap analysis of the countries. Next slide, please. So coming to the third area, here the area of direct and indirectly financing mitigation and adaptation projects. Here, the fourth recommendation is that the Secretariat should create institutional and organizational structures that operationalize direct and indirect finance for private sector activities as outlined in the mandate. The fourth area relates to the private sector participation. And here, the fifth recommendation is the IEU would recommend to set out a strategic priority for the GCF to channel finance to medium and small size enterprises, exploring access modalities and appropriate instruments for a decentralized adaptation and mitigation action. So lastly, and finally, the fifth area relates to the enabling involvement of private sector actors in the SIDS and LDCs. So our last sixth recommendation is that the GCF board and the Secretariat should expand the focus on financial instruments and GCF support, especially to enable private sector investments in adaptation, in particular in the SIDS and LDCs. I would stop here in interest of time and look forward to the discussion. So back to you, Archie, Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. Catalyze or leverage. Thank you so much, Andreas. Henry, you've had the opportunity to read the report and prepare a management response, and we look forward to hearing from you the key features of the management response of the Secretariat to this evaluation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Archie. Thank you, Andreas, and thank you to the entire team of the unit. Indeed, not only am I presenting on behalf of the Secretariat, but this was discussed at the senior management team, and we first of all would like to congratulate the unit for its diligent work, and also for the collaborative approach in providing us with input that as a learning organization we're going to be implementing. In the next slide, I would like to structure the presentation of our response in two different segments. The first is providing a little bit of context. As normal, evaluations are a snapshot of a moment where you are looking at the evolution of an organization at that specific moment. However, organic nature of places like the GCF also provide a more dynamic view of the direction of journey and the direction of travel. And I think this is something that I would like to present in three specific areas. First of all, as I mentioned, most of the recommendations and the findings resonate broadly with the Secretariat. We, with our experience in previous evaluations and lessons that we've taken, some of them have been already implementing some pivoting, or we're working on a few changes. There are three areas that you mentioned, Andreas, that are indeed central to the functioning of GCF. Country ownership is indeed one of them. And here, the context that I would like to present is that when looking at the portfolio of the private sector facility, 46% of the private sector funded activities have been sponsored by direct access entities. That represents 16 out of 35 projects that are currently approved. It's almost $900 million committed. That represents in nominal terms a third of our portfolio, almost. So while there's room to improve our national access and working a lot more with direct access or regional direct access, I think we have been trying to indeed go in that direction. So here, the context is that while there's room, I think there's been some progress, and this is indeed central to how we operate. In regards to results measurement, I agree, and we at the management team agree that it is important to improve some of the logic models and incorporate them. But recently, the board approved the integrated results management framework that is also trying to measure the catalytic effects. This is a very recent development. Therefore, it would be interesting to hear more clarity on how to improve that tool. But we believe that with the enhancement that this tool went through in the latest board meeting, this should allow us to have a better tool in order for us to be able to track the impact of our interventions. The last part is direct financing. As of today, the 100% of the private sector facility portfolio is channeled through accredited entities. We do not do direct investing as of now. And this was something that I thought it was important just to provide the context. The second point is that some of the recommendations that you presented are actually being implemented in different degrees, but are being implemented by some of our recent projects. We believe that the GCF1 portfolio already shows some of this evolution into that catalytic capital rather than just the leverage aspect that you mentioned. And lastly, and I will go a lot deeper into this, we are currently undergoing a strategy review of the private sector at GCF. This strategy review has already been presented in a first phase of consultations to board members. to active observers, and we will continue doing that as this is not going to be discussed in the next board meeting. So the timely report that you prepared serves us very well to confirm some of the trends in that strategy. Because if you look, that strategy is going to be focusing on 4 important prongs. The first one is promoting a conducive investment environment and strengthening capacity. So this for us is key in order to engage more local private sector, to engage more players. There is indeed a need for enhancement of capacity. The second one is acceleration of innovation for climate technologies, financing instruments, and business models. So the idea is, how do we somehow expand what some people have called vanilla models or plain vanilla models into using new financing tools, into using technology that would aid incubators and accelerators, that would help accelerate the technologies that would make it a lot more feasible to have climate technology, and also business models. How could we work with MSMEs, as you mentioned? How could we work with different type of organizations? The third goes at the heart of what you mentioned as catalyzing, is how do we de-risk market creating investments to crowd in private sector capital? And lastly, strengthening of domestic financial systems and institutions to scale up climate finance. So for us, the local view remains very key. And these are the 4 sort of big pillars of our strategy that we are under consultation. The next slide is going to tackle each of your recommendations with some response. I mean, in most of these, we fully agree or partially agree. And we take this, as I mentioned before, as an exchange of a learning process. So in regards to this question of high-risk fund or catalyzing, I mean, first of all, here we stand ready to support the board on accreditation policy and strategy decisions that would help us achieve that catalytic role. Catalytic financing is the focus of the forthcoming strategy, as I just mentioned. And measuring catalytic impact is complex. It might require additional resources, but at least we believe that the IRMS tool is already in that direction. So we hope that with this, we will be able to address those issues that you presented. In regards to speed and transparency of the operations of the fund, we believe that there is room for improvement, but the Secretariat has decreased average time for reviews of financial proposals through process improvements in digitization. And also, if we are able to operationalize the project-specific assessment approach, that would facilitate greater scale and speed. So we think that the board could also, guide us in some of these important changes in order to be a lot more responsive to our countries. The next slide, we will continue going through the third point, which was regarding country ownership. How do we ensure that these projects are country owned? How do we ensure that the access to the funds are, driven by country priorities and country decisions? Here we are 100%. We are trying to align accreditation applications with financial proposals. We are making sure that country programs are aligning with private sector approaches and strategies. And we believe that we remain, and the strategy is also indicating that, ready to help countries translate NDCs into investment plans. That is the 4-prong that I mentioned about domestic capital and domestic markets would be to align some of our projects to those NDCs plans. The no objection letters remain important. We are going to the board with a few multi-country projects where we were able to get very good support, and that support was extremely important through the NDAs and to the national bodies that we have in the field. In regards to creating a better institutional and organizational structure to operationalize direct and indirect financing, I think you do mention the importance of clarifying the roles of PSF and DMA. I think our collaboration is a very fluid and very constructive collaboration. They provide us, PSF, with a lot of technical expertise on sectors. They provide us with a lot of knowledge. They manage some MSME projects that are very important. We try to contribute as well with our financial structuring expertise, with our financial instruments expertise. But there is indeed a call for PSF to expand its private sector only portfolio by working a lot more with equity funds, by working a lot more with MSME banks, and working a lot more with financial institutions that are privately owned. I think this would always remain a bit of a gray area, but in principle, we would like to see our role in the private sector and BMA's role on the public sector. Readiness projects could and preparatory support projects could really allow us to do mapping of private sector actors in national context in order to understand how we could also work with those. Lastly, in the other slide, we are trying to go into the last two recommendations. We were around the strategic priority of MSMEs, exploring different access modalities. Here, we believe that both private sector and public sector financial proposals support MSMEs through blended finance and financial intermediation. We indeed in the strategy are also focusing how we could improve this, how we could expand this. In recent experience with some of the readiness grants that we have provided, we are working with local business communities, with chambers of commerce, with business roundtables, in order for us to be able to be more responsive to some of those needs of the market. And we indeed, as I mentioned before, we stand ready to help countries translate their NDCs into investment plans. In regards to the expanding the financial instruments, given that it has a strong bias as of now in senior loans, indeed, we are working towards that. We're working into bringing new forms of blended finance using more equity or guarantees. Our pipeline that we're going to hopefully be seeing approved in the next B.30 has some of these examples with a very strong adaptation or cross-cutting modality. So we are indeed conscious of that need of bringing more adaptation or more cross-cutting into our deal. Lastly, the Secretariat is working on improving its capacity and work closely with the different bodies, with the board, with ITAB, and among different departments to increase our adaptation approach. And we believe that this is sort of the direction that the strategy, one, it is approved by the board, will help us implement and operationalize. The last thing, as I finish my intervention and look forward to the exchanges and discussion, is that we are a young organization, if you were to look at it from a timeline perspective. And I think having this evaluation, somehow assessing our first phase, it's really important. But currently, with the USP for 2023, with GCF1 and with the strategy, we are ready to go to the next phase of development, of growth, that hopefully will be increasing private capital flowing into our emerging countries with the focus on seeds, on LDCs in African states, and also keeping the balance of adaptation and mitigation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Secretariat, and I look forward to the exchanges from the audience and from the colleagues here.
Thank you so much, Henry. Very, very wise words there. Colleagues, we are circulating the links to the Padlet once again, and the link to the report that's just launched as well once again in your chat boxes. So please feel free to use the Padlet. Some colleagues have already started to post questions there, which we'll come to in just a minute. But before we get there, let me just ask my colleague Asha to give us a list of the methods that we used for this evaluation, and what were some of the methods that we used to collect the data for this evaluation.
Thank you, Archie, and thank you, Henry and Andreas, for your wonderful presentation. So as part of the evaluation team, these are some of the methods that we used. We conducted a document review. We looked at 117 GCF and non-GCF documents. We also conducted an analysis of the GCF portfolio, mostly done by the IU's very own data lab. And we conducted 184 semi-structured interviews with some of the participants here. Thank you all for joining. And a perception study, so an online survey, which we had about 50+ responses on that one. And we also conducted 6 country case studies in Armenia, Bangladesh, Burkina Faso, Chile, Ghana, and the Pacific Islands, mostly focusing on Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and a landscape analysis, which examines the strategic priorities set up by the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement for the GCF's private sector approach. And we identified lessons from the approaches of other climate and development funds with similar mandates or similar approaches, so a benchmarking study, as you would say. So thank you so much, Archie. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks a lot, Asha. And very quickly, there's a question in the Padlet speaking about NOLs, letters of no objection from the NDA, and how they guarantee country ownership in a multi-country proposal specifically. I'll ask my colleague Galina, who led the data part of this evaluation, to perhaps give us a comment on the relationship between country ownership and NOLs, and I know it's an area that's really dear to her, and also speak very briefly, if she might, some of her favorite insights from the distribution of the portfolio, the private sector portfolio and the DMA portfolio. Galina.
Thank you, Archie. On the NOLs, it's a very interesting topic, because I think that was one of the key findings of the evaluation, like really cracks the country drivenness versus country ownership, and the details which how we distinguish between the two. And we found that, of course, while GCF is using NOLs as a tool to ensure country ownership, it doesn't provide country drivenness, which is actually really key for the private sector and local level. And for instance, if we look further and we see what's reported in the APRs, and there is a part where actually the AEs can report whether they share the APR reports with the NDA, then we actually see there is a certain gap there. So even though there was initial agreement, at least to some, depends on the level of stakeholder engagements, of course, but we see that NOL is probably, it's obligatory, but it's not sufficient to provide country drivenness of the projects as we would like to. Further, if I can share, I don't think I can share a slide. Okay, no, I can. No, I cannot. Okay, let's quickly talk about a couple of patterns that we saw in terms of how GCF was channeling its finance up to B29, which was the cutoff date for this evaluation. Thank you, Henry, for raising the point about static snapshot and looking at the dynamic, how things are evolving, and putting that into the context. That's really important, and I think we tried to incorporate this perspective as well. So for me, it was very interesting to see at early stages of the evaluation that when looking at the finance distribution across the result areas, we see that the project under DMA and PSF, they behave differently, that there is, of course, some variation of the finance under DMA projects across result areas, but that PSF portfolio is predominantly targeting energy generation and access, and is strongly focused on the mitigation, and that projects that focus solely on adaptation, they take only 1.4% of the PSF portfolio in terms of financial volume. Another thing is, also if we look at the project pipeline, we still see similar pattern where only 7% of the project pipeline is dedicated to pure adaptation. Also, if we look at the financial instruments and overall portfolio, we see that it is concentrated, it is focused on grants and loans, and there is limited uptake of equity and guarantees. And while PSF projects constitute a smaller part of GSF's portfolio, they are relying primarily on non-grant instruments. And if we look at the private sector E's, this trend is even more persistent. Private sector E's, they are constituting a subset of PSF project portfolio. And of course, in this evaluation, we assessed GCF's approach to private sector through several lenses, and divisional split and A sector being just one of them. But coming back to the financial instruments use, there is limited funding channeled via grants under PSF portfolio, which can indicate that there is limited focus on enabling environments in high-risk technologies or business model. I think that's also something that was very interesting to see. Over from my side, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Gala. Let's turn very quickly, colleagues. Just once again, for colleagues who might have joined a little bit late, please feel free to raise your hands or virtual hands, and we'll come to you, or post your questions on the Padlet, which is available to you in your chat boxes, and we can post questions and comments, etc., over there, and we'll take those questions. So that was a very interesting point about the NOL process. There are also other questions in the chat box about, for instance, there's a question on enabling environments for private sector, and particularly focusing on adaptation. I might ask Andreas to comment on that very briefly. Andreas, could you tell us a little bit about some of the things that might constitute, from this perspective, an enabling environment for the private sector?
Okay, thanks, Archie, and thanks for this. Let me say, also from the perspective of enabling environments, there are obviously different ways of addressing the question of enabling environments. One would be to address it through RPSP, so the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program. It could also be done through project preparation and a project preparation facility. It could also be done through projects themselves. And I think that is the point that we were making just a minute ago or so, or a couple of minutes ago when I was making my presentation. It should really be looked at from several perspectives. So let me, just before I come back to this question of what the enabling environments are, let's just quickly talk about how could the GCF address it. And I see this here in this palette. There are also a question of what have you actually found that is a little bit more on a positive note. So yes, the positive note is here. We do support countries, developing countries, in the strengthening of capacity building, and in this strengthening of their capacity and with capacity building efforts, as well as with technical assistance. So RPSP is a program that's working. It's done continuously. The question here was rather on how are we targeting the private sector? Are we thinking about the private sector? And secondly, are we providing institutional and organizational linkages that link the private sector facility in particular, that thinks day and night about what private sector could do for the fund, or how we could attract the right partners? So in that, the question here is very much on how can we steer the RPSP program to even deliver on the question of private sector involvement, but also the enabling environments as such, right? So and then secondly, when we think about the projects, there's a variety of different opportunities that one could choose for what type of project we would like to do and how we would like to do that project. And here I'd like to draw a little bridge towards some of our other work that we do at the IU. And here we're doing global evidence reviews. Those are evidence gap maps that basically show on what evidence do we have and where do we not have strong evidence. So we basically comparing all the types of interventions through across several sectors versus the outcomes that we'd like to achieve, and we try to identify what sort of knowledge is there and in the broader development as well as climate finance landscape. And what we found there is, unfortunately, there's very little information and very little knowledge of what works and what doesn't, and for whom, in the area of policy and in the area of institutional enabling environments. And here, from our perspective of the IU, we're obviously always thinking about the GCF as a thought leader, as a learning organization that likes to leapfrog from other experiences. We tend to say that if we truly want to reach the adaptation question in the developing countries, we ought to think outside the box as Henry said, we ought to go beyond vanilla projects and think about other areas that we need to tackle to ensure that other private sector entities in the countries feel enabled to contribute to the fight against climate change. And that is also something that we saw with the stakeholders, and Asha mentioned the 6 countries. We saw that vividly in countries like Burkina Faso. I did the country mission myself. I heard most often that private sector actors locally are very interested in joining forces with the Green Climate Fund and providing these steps, but are feeling unable to do so because the regulatory requirements in the countries may not allow them to do so, or may not be up to that level that they would require in order to also consider their own risks in doing so and joining forces with the GCF. And here we've seen climate information projects and climate information actors that would really think there's a great opportunity for the GCF to also build climate resilient development pathways for countries such as Burkina Faso. And that's only one example, but I wanted to draw the attention to this. So again, it's not always all bad. It's just a question of how do we drive it and what could we use. And so lastly, and before I give it back, because I don't want to monopolize on time here, but lastly, I also wanted to refer to one of the comments made by Henry on the IRMF. And you're absolutely right, Henry. The Integrated Results Management Framework is something that is a new policy being passed by the board, and we've been happy that this policy was finally taken up. It will only come into effect that for projects after B.32. So naturally, it was very difficult for us as evaluators looking at the past projects to predict and how they would work for a new framework that doesn't even apply to old projects. But having said that, the IRMF was obviously based on a review that we've done here at the IAU in 2018, and that was the review of the results management framework. And there we found that at the time in 2018, the fund was not looking sufficiently enough at the question of the IPCC report, indicating that enabling environments are crucial for the fight against climate change and are crucial for development projects that want to be climate smart. And here in particular, the IPCC report 2018 said we ought to look at the enabling environments for private sector. So we also included this in the report. We were concerned when reviewing the IRMF that enabling environments in general are tackled, but not enabling environments for private sector. So we thought that this was an omission that could cause problems further down the line. So I'll keep it at that, Archie. Apologies for taking too much time here. Back to you, Archie.
Thanks a lot, Andreas. It's indeed very complex questions and questions that have to apply to virtually all of the recipient countries. Henry, if I could turn to you really quickly and get your insights about this very complex process that we've spoken about, NOLs, and there's a question also in the chat about the procurement and whether the strategy considers it. But could you speak to us about that a little bit, about the role of NOLs and what you think about country ownership in relation to private sector project portfolio of the GCF?
Sure. Thank you very much. And indeed, the no objection letters is somehow the instrument that formalizes the country ownership from a financing proposal. However, the process of the NOL could certainly be improved, could certainly be a deeper engagement. Today, coincidentally, we had a conversation with an NDA about this very topic. And in the sense that they gave us very, very candid feedback that sometimes the NOLs were only searched at the moment of pre-approval or approval, whereas they would have liked to have been engaged early on. And I think that this is something that if country programs start incorporating a lot more the private sector in its new versions, and that is deepened, and we at PSF could also engage with our colleagues in country programming, hopefully we could see that this is not just a tick the box or a letter that is only needed, but also something that is responding to the needs of the countries. So I think it's important to somehow provide more insights on that process. Having said this, it's also important to understand that the mechanism of the NOL could be easier applied to public sector programs than to private sector programs. So here we're trying to engage two different funding sources with very different dynamics and with very different realities with the same tool. And this is something that for how we believe that there should be some flexibilities in our modalities of financing that somehow will be more responsive to the realities of the private sector. Time is of the essence, and some of these processes are very complex. And while we do understand that this is a key factor, and we have proven successful ways of engaging private sectors to get NOLs and to get multi-country projects, we've got in the next board, we have a few that have, several countries, and they have been able to get the NOLs. I think it's also important to understand the nature of private sector capital, and that sometimes, these exercises could be quite burdensome, and in some cases, this might not somehow attract the capital that is needed. So I think it's always a bit of a compromise. How do we make sure that the AEs are properly engaging with the national entities in building this project together in a co-creation way with good feedback loops, but at the same time understanding that there is room for flexibility required in order for these investments to be feasible. That is one important element. In regards to policy, so I'm going to broaden the procurement question and go a lot more into policy. I think the policy, it's a very important area, and this will go most likely, as Andreas mentioned, in the enabling environment. One of the areas that for us is extremely important is around local currency. How could we somehow create opportunities where local currency solutions could be presented? Another one could be on capital markets in those countries that are able to develop or to have functional capital markets. Could we use some of the structures and to increase green bonds, or to increase the issuance of capital instruments that are going to be aligned also with some of the climate action goals that we are trying to promote. So I think that definitely policy is very important in the enabling environment. And I also think that, the way we engage with NOLs should be more constructive, could be more dynamic, and not just a requirement. I think we at the Secretariat are having discussions, and we'll have more discussions with the AEs in order to also make them aware of the importance. But as you know, we have limited capacity from a resource perspective, and the growth that we are experiencing at the Secretariat and the level of detail that we have to do in all our stages will require an increase in capabilities.
Thanks, Henry. Those are very important questions. And, we want to also come back to the priorities of countries, which you've spoken about very quickly. But I'll just very quickly turn to first a question on the Padlet about financial instruments and the use of financial instruments for lasting impacts beyond the investments. And Galina, I know have some data that you might be able to share with us on the use of financial instruments in the GCF. Can you speak to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So yeah, as I was mentioning previously, okay, I still cannot share screen. Yeah, as I was mentioning previously, there is a distinction in how financial instruments are used in across the divisions and across the different types of accredited entities, public or private. And so basic projects, they heavily rely on the loans, equity, and there is only 280 million US dollars that are channeled through grants, which might say that some of the projects, they might benefit from the grant instruments that are directed towards the creation of an enabling environment, especially if we're talking about the priority countries such as Cs and ODCs. And it might be key and critical, especially at early stages of engagement of GCF in these countries, to direct efforts towards developing the lacking policy and legal frameworks that would actually remove some of the barriers to the climate finance and would enable local actors to engage better and in a more long-lasting ways with the GCF. Over.
Thanks, Gala. And I'll turn to Andreas really quickly as well about if he can share a couple of thoughts with us on targeting of the GCF to countries and country priorities, particularly to NDCs. And there's a particular analysis that I know, Andreas, you're really fond of. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thanks, Archie. I think I know which graph you're talking about, because I've been really growing fond of a couple of graphs in the evaluation report, which highlights a question of country priorities and the question of how does the GCF target those country priorities. In terms of definition, it's very difficult to find a good indicator for country priorities. As of now, and I believe most of my colleagues from the climate financing space will agree with me, NDCs are one of the good ways to showcase the different priorities that we have. So I have a graph. I'll try my luck with this one. If you don't mind, I'll share it real quickly. So this is directly from the report. And you will see, I hope I can increase this a little bit. Yes, you will see directly from the report here that it shows here, it shows the extent to which the private sector facility funding proposals are directed towards the needs of the countries expressed through the NDCs. So what you see here you see the result areas from adaptation and mitigation on the very left. And then you see the first graph is basically the count of all the eligible countries. So the number of countries in which private sector facility projects are directed towards the result areas that are mapped out according to the result areas here in adaptation and mitigation, 8 in total of the GCF, and that are also stated in the NDCs. So that's basically a fairly good number to tell you something about the single country and multi-country projects that we have and how they are, how the countries with those projects are reflected in this graph. On the very right, so the very right-hand side, the orange side that you see there, this column shows you the numbers of countries in which no private sector project is directed towards the result areas that's also stated in the NDCs. So here we basically see what else the private sector facility could be looking at in order to fill gaps. And that's also, let's also be honest, obviously, and not all private sector projects can solve all the problems of a country. So we'll all find it's just an opportunity to look at. What's interesting, however, is the middle column. And the middle column shows you the number of countries in which private sector projects of the private sector facility are directed towards resort areas that are not mentioned in the NDCs. So this is what I meant earlier as well when I spoke about the targeting in respect of the national plans and the national priorities. And here we see that the country priorities are not mentioned, and there are still projects there in areas that are not identified by the countries themselves as being key priorities, at least not identified through the NDCs, we must say. And that is, if for the lack of a better word, that is a slight misalignment in the sense of GCF private sector facility projects in those countries. So I hope, again, I try to keep it short. I hope that it gives you a little bit of an insight on what I meant with the question of targeting and the question of looking at country priorities and describing the country priorities and aligning with the country priorities from the sides of the private sector facility. Let me, Archie, if you allow me one other second, just because I wanted to say, and I forgot this in my first intervention, I wanted to applaud to what Henry had mentioned here in the Secretariat's response on country programs. So a second thought here is obviously country programs are immensely important and are paramount to better understand of what countries truly want and what countries truly could execute in terms of projects. Because country programs do not only describe the vulnerabilities of a country, they also describe a potential pipeline. And here's my little however though. However, when we spoke to stakeholders in the countries, as well as stakeholders in the GCF ecosystem, we found that at the moment, country programs are not sufficiently used and effectively used. In the sense that we made this with a very easy question. We asked the question of what are people thinking of country programs? What are they there for? What's the use? And we got various responses. Some say this is definitely to describe the GCF future portfolio of a country that the GCF could fund. Other stakeholders describe, no, this is just a long list, a wish list of all the things that we could be doing and we would like to be doing. And again, others describe this to be, this is the long list of all the climate projects that we would like to do, but not necessarily only with the GCF, but perhaps also with the Adaptation Fund, with the GEF and others. So here, this also highlights very easily that there is this question of the lack of clarity that we have around country programs and how they could really truly be used as an effective tool to describe country priorities and country ownership all in all. So I'll give it back to you, Archie. Apologies for the delay.
Thanks a lot, Andreas. We have just 2 minutes left, and Leanne has messaged me in the chat box that she's about to leave and asking a very important question on reporting and whether instruments are related to how well we can report on GCF investments. And Leanne, to address your question, the finding 25 in the report does very directly address that, and it's on page 58 if once you download the report. So that's your nudge to download the report and read it, which says that there is limited oversight on on some of the conditions, FAA conditions, and limited oversight over the reporting and the compliance on these FAA conditions. And it does relate to financial instruments because the riskier the project, the more conditions, and therefore the higher the number of conditions. But there are limits to self-reporting in the GCF system, and there are limited resources available to the Secretariat staff to monitor that. So I'll just very quickly address that, and the report goes into a lot more detail. Not a lot more detail, but at least sufficient detail to have a finding on that very issue that you're raising, and it's a very important one. Colleagues, we're at the end of the hour, and we have to wrap up now because there is another session scheduled for the board very shortly. So just to conclude, perhaps I'd invite our panel members just once again to provide us with their concluding remarks, a key takeaway perhaps from this evaluation or from the discussion that we've had today. So perhaps I'll first go to Henry. Henry, any concluding remarks from your side?
No, thank you very much. I mean, this exchange is a rich one, and unfortunately 1 hour is not enough because I would like to address some of the things that Andreas mentioned, but maybe just to live with a reality. And that is that we do not have infinite resources. We have finite resources. And it is going to be important, the prioritization of where our capital has the biggest additionality and the biggest value added. And I think this is very important because it would be impossible with the capital that we have to comply with all the country requests. It is important to understand which countries are not getting this capital from other sources and where should GCF be. And that is a very difficult art to play because obviously there is a political mandate on the fund of country driven, and every country would like the projects to be approved. So that is something that I think we need to work through and hopefully little by little find ways of prioritizing in the right places with the right instruments and the right actors. Thank you for the opportunity. I remain available to everyone if you would like to contact me at the Secretariat, and looking forward to further exchanges.
Thank you so much, Henry. Before I give the floor to Andreas, I know board member Reina has raised her hand. Reina, would you like to come in?
Thank you very much, Archie. And also my congratulations, because this presentation is rich enough to understand the difficulty of having a result that will be fine for every country. Then it is an evolution, a construction, and a building very good made. Thank you very much. Oh, excuse me. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because different times we have. All the best, all the warm for you. I have a question concerned to the document, because the recommended criteria for country consideration is, as they conduct country coordination and multi-stakeholder engagement. Then you speak, as Henry has mentioned, about the level of national priorities and strategies, having in consideration that we have a limited possibility of funds. Then my question is, first of all, if you have taken into consideration that all the developing countries are developing countries, then vulnerability, need of adaptation, urgency of mitigation, deeply concerned about resilience is the same for vulnerability communities, people, village. So, from Latin America and the Caribbean, we kindly ask for the possibility to have in consideration that though the differentiation established by the Paris Agreement and this Framework Convention on Climate Change, more divisions are not possible. And then all developing countries has the same angst, the same hopes, and the same state of necessity in vulnerable communities. Then what is expected to ensure high-level political support as seen as appropriate for each country? There we have to develop what is the appropriate high-level political support, because organization of developing countries in constitutional terms are different. Then we have a national designated authority that sits the high-level political support. Then just a matter of consideration, of thinking about, to define about the political support and what is the requisite. Thank you once more. Congratulations for this presentation.
Thank you so much, Raina, for those wonderful words of encouragement and for reading the report and engaging with us today. And I say that on behalf of both the IU and the Secretariat, that we really, really welcome the rich inputs and the rich engagement that, from the members of the board. Andres, would you like to wrap up and address Raina's question?
Sure, thanks. Raina, thank you again once more also from my end for your intervention. It's always encouraging to hear you speak about obviously the obvious thing in climate change action, or a fight against climate change from the perspective of a developing country. We all agree the mandate of the fund is very clear. The establishment of the fund is very clear. It is there to provide financing opportunities and support, both public and private, for the developing countries. And I must say, what we have learned across the past evaluations is that the approach of one size fits all is not always adequate. In particular, when we speak about developing countries and the most vulnerable countries amongst those with the SIDS and the LDCs, where the question of the complexity of the local engagement is very prominent, and the question of how to engage with the variety of actors that could help to do that is equally challenging. So that's why we were encouraged by most of our stakeholders to speak about the enabling environment. And we're very happy to hear you agreeing with this as well. So from the IU, As a closing remark, I can just say it remains an interesting time, and these are interesting times we live in, and the IU sees its clear mandate in providing the necessary information for decision making for the board, as well as the lessons learned that help the fund to grow and to improve in the right direction. So we stand ready to be there with our colleagues from the Secretariat to make this all possible. And we hope for the years to come, we can and we will do so. So thanks again. Thank you very much.
Interesting times indeed. Andreas, Henry, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Colleagues, thank you so much for spending this 1 hour with us. We've gone a few minutes over ahead. We've got a few minutes over the time that we set for ourselves, but we've come to the end of the side event. We have to let our board members go and attend their consultation. Ladies and gentlemen, as you read the report, please do get in touch with the IU for feedback, comments, and questions that you might have. Thank you once again for your time, and we look forward very much to staying in touch. Have a great day.
Goodbye.
And thank you, Archie.